wind up spending a lot of time with people outside of church trying to get at what we mean by this word religion in our culture. There are a lot of surveys in our culture about people who are religious, and we have these assumptions around this word. And the assumptions, if we'd say, well, so-and-so is religious, we mean that, well, they go to a church, or to a temple, or to a mosque, or some sort of religious organization, usually tied to, let's say, Christianity, or Judaism, or Islam, or Hinduism, or Buddhism. They have practices and rituals that they do, and we say those things are religious. But the truth is that no one really talked this way before the modern era. And if you would go in a time, if you had a time machine and went back to ancient Greece, and you would see all of the altars and all of the idols and all of the statues and all of the temples, they kind of use the word, but we would say they're extremely religious, and people would there look at you and say, well, what do you mean? Because for the most part, basically what your truest religion is are your basic assumptions about how the world works and how you can get what you want from the world, or even what you think you want from the world. Religion is so massive and so deep and so pervasive. In the Reformed community, we have often said, all of life is religious. And almost anything we try to do has a religious component. What do we do to try to get where we want to go? What are we afraid of? What do you think is ideal? And what are you willing to sacrifice in order to bring it into being? Now, the Bible asserts that the creator of the universe is the main agent of our glorious future. Now, this is very different from what I would say the predominant religion in our culture is, because actually we've part of the reason there's so much anxiety in the world is that our culture doesn't believe there necessarily is a glorious future. Younger generations predominantly have a great deal of anxiety about climate change. Older generations grew up in an age where we understood that nations have nuclear weapons, and now watching Russia and Ukraine fight, we're worried, will that escalate? Will nuclear weapons come into play? The Christians believe that, in fact, we and this world have a glorious future ahead of us, and that future is being brought to us by God. Advent is a season of waiting for and anticipating for light to come. But when we look around at people, we notice that people are self-destructive. We see the flood story. That's basically one of the lessons of the flood story. People were so self-destructive and destructive of each other that God sent a flood to basically reset the situation. God pursues a new relational effort through Abram. Abraham is expanded into a nation through Israel. And as this quote that I use often, biblical Israel is the theater in which God plays out his relation with all humankind. Now, Israel is rescued from slavery in Egypt, and Israel is given a common religion playbook in the desert. Hopes seem realized in some way through David and Solomon. This has been what we've been going through in the last number of months. We've been talking about the monarchy. Now, for the last few weeks, we've been talking about the prophets. We talked about Isaiah. We talked about Jeremiah. Prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah were sent because Israel was not keeping up its end of the bargain in terms of how it should relate to God and how it would be saved. The Creator God is looking to reconcile himself with the world, and Israel wasn't playing her part correctly. Things didn't improve. Israel becomes subject to the greater empires of the world. Last week we heard that burning Jeremiah's scroll didn't stop the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile. Judah would go into exile. The northern kingdom, Israel, was destroyed and dispersed. Babylon would destroy the temple. The curses of Deuteronomy would come true. And then the question is, what would become of God's mission to the world through Israel? Now, we're going to probably the most important pivotal book of the Old Testament pointing to the new is the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel starts in this way. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, we learned about him last time. He was sort of a vassal of Egypt, appointed, a son of Josiah, appointed over Judah in order to keep Judah in line with Egypt's geopolitical interests. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Actually, we think this effort was probably around, I believe, 605. Nebuchadnezzar didn't destroy the temple in this trip. In this trip, he basically attacked, took Judah apart a little bit, and was satisfied taking wealth and the best and the brightest people for his slaves. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim of Judah into his hand. Jehoiakim was the vassal of Egypt, so Nebuchadnezzar knew, okay, Jehoiakim is out. I'm going to put a new puppet, Zedekiah, in, another son of Josiah, and he'll be my puppet in Jerusalem. Was it Zedekiah? It might have been Jehoiachin. I don't remember. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles of the temple of God. So he took gold and silver, and he carried these off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put the treasures in the house of his God. And that was exactly as you would imagine. The point was, the gods of Babylon are superior to the gods of petty Judah. So we're going to rob his house, take his good things, and put them in the treasure stores of Babylon. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring to the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. Now this might sound as strange, but the different empires of the world had different assimilation policies. You see, it was a perpetual struggle for these empires when they would conquer a land to keep that land subjugated. And the Assyrians would basically divide and conquer. They would take many of the people out of the land, take people of other lands, and put them in basically a big mixing process. That's what the Assyrians would do. The Babylonians were a little bit more savvy. The Babylonians said, look, we're the new bosses. We want to reign in your country, but we want to be benevolent rulers. We want you to assimilate into the Babylonian way. So what the Babylonians would do was take the brightest and the best, bring them up to Babylon, rename them according to their gods, likely castrate the men so they didn't have divided interest of family versus servant. They would, for the most part, be slaves, but again, slavery was a very different thing than what most Americans think about. And they would want to assimilate these young men, have them serve the gods of Babylon, have them serve the king of Babylon, and have them be useful for the court of Babylon. That's why you take young men. And then have them also be useful for subjugating the lands that they are from. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were trained for 3 years. And after that, they were entered the king's service. So you might wonder, well, what kind of training did they undergo? Well, one of the things we know of the Babylonians, a little bit later we'll hear from Magi of the East. Well, these are Babylonians. What kinds of training do you want for court officials? Astrology. There's a lot of that. Maybe reading entrails. Basically, the job of court officials was to warn the kings what the gods wanted or were up to so that the king could be in line so that the king could get what he wanted. So it's quite likely that these young Hebrew men were castrated, so they would never have children, they would never have family. They would be given good food, they would be well treated, given education according to the Babylonian religion, because religion is how to make life work, and then they would serve the king of Babylon in any way he desired. Along these were the names, were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, if you remember, they're given different names. Belshazzar, Bel is a Babylonian god. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, then they are all given Babylonian names because they are now property of Babylon and property of the Babylonian gods, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all tied to Babylonian gods, Babylonian astrology, the Babylonian system, because religion is how to make life work. Now, the book of Daniel is an important transition in the Bible because up until the exile, the whole idea was that Israel and Judah as kingdoms would be on display of God's reign in the world over them, and these kingdoms would be so successful that the world would stop and say, wow, they've got the best religion. They are the most powerful kingdoms. They clearly are doing the best, but they didn't follow the covenant, and so they're subjugated. So what will God do? And you begin to see a transition happen in the Bible that would come to full flourishing in the New Testament. It's an important transitional book in terms of the way God would relate to the world. Like much of the Old Testament, the royal court remains important. So Daniel's stories are all about the royal court, similar to Elijah and Ahab and David and Nathan, all of those stories about the royal court. But God's voice would usually come through a servant, someone from below. Daniel and his friends were likely castrated and became court slaves for the emperor. Slavery in the ancient world was complex and pervasive. You could have wealthy and powerful slaves. The Ethiopian eunuch that we meet in the book of Acts was, again, he was castrated, so he wouldn't have family obligations. He wouldn't sleep with the king's harem, but he could be a powerful royal official, a trusted slave who would manage great things in the empire. How will God's mission survive pagan domination? There's the anxiety. There's the tension. And who is Israel to be? Now, the book of Daniel is really divided into two main sections. Chapters 1 through 6 have all the stories that you learned when you were a child and you're very familiar with. And 7 through 12 have all of these apocalyptic, mysterious stories of monsters and beasts and seas and all of that. And Daniel is the connection between these two. In the first series of stories, Daniel is a superhero. Daniel always comes out on top. Daniel always wins the struggle. The first chapters 1 through 6 are tests of supremacy of the God of Israel through the trials and ordeals of faithfulness to God and his covenant rather than imperial pagan domination. The key image for the testing of the body of the people of Israel is always, will they stay faithful? And that we see in Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Chapters 7 through 12 are quite different. They're apocalypse, sort of like the book of Revelation. It's the revelation of spiritual unseen forces beneath the workings of the world. Now again, this is exactly how Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are trained to look at the spiritual underpinnings beneath the world. That isn't totally different from what we do today. A president will bring in new people who have training or experience in economics, in business, in science, in medicine. Because in our materialist age, we think, well, these are the underpinnings of our world. Daniel's correctness in chapters 1 through 6 is validated in the first part of the book. And that's why he has authority in the visions in the second part of the book. Now we're going to talk about chapter 6, which is the climax of the first half of the book. Now, the Babylonians by this point have already been knocked over by the Medes and the Persians, and King Darius is in charge. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom. Now, the Babylonians had a fairly centralized structure. The Persians would be a much longer-lasting, larger, and more successful empire. And part of the reason for that was the Persians loved bureaucracy. So they would set these satraps over the whole empire, and those satraps were then answerable to three key people, and they were answerable to the emperor. So it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. And if you watch Daniel through the first part of the book, again and again, Daniel would show himself to know better than anyone else how the universe worked, because the God, the creator God of the universe, would give Daniel insight through dreams and visions, and that would always give the king, the right insider information for the king to know what to do. This is in some ways similar to what we saw with Joseph back with Pharaoh in Egypt and Pharaoh's dreams. Daniel is very much like that. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. In other words, there's an accountability structure, there's a bureaucracy. And if a certain province isn't doing well, that administrator is going to visit that satrap and say, hey, what's going on in your province? Taxes need to be paid, insurrections need to be put down, things need to be prosperous. Get down there and make it work. And that's what the administrators are for. So the king would sit with his 3 administrators, and they would all have, presumably, about 40 satraps to manage. Now, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. And this is what you see with Daniel again and again, and you remember that story from Joseph. Daniel is so good that Daniel's regions are flourishing. And the king notices this. And so the king says, I'm going to put you in charge of the administrators. And you're going to teach the administrators how to administer so that the whole kingdom will flourish. Just like today, however, while there's an army of experts, pundits, and advisors that seek to assist the powerful of the world in getting what they want out of the world. Now, in the ancient world, this would show up in the most predictive capacity. So just like you saw with Joseph, everything flourished under him, everything flourished under Daniel. But if you've ever worked in government, and many of you have, you also notice that people are petty and envious. And if you become the boss's favor, you have a target on your back. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. But they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And those are the 2 ways that you know politics. If you want to get after someone, find where they've been negligent or find if they're corrupt. And if you can find those things, you can bring them down. But there's none of that in Daniel. Why? And this is key with this transition that we see happening in the Bible. Right now, all sorts of people are jockeying for favor and reputation to find positions in a new administration. Those who are behind are often envious and will do whatever it takes to sully the reputation of their rival. Daniel's position in the court here is key to understanding the transition from God's people as world-dominating imperial power, as in David and Solomon, to a spiritual witness to Israel's God's preeminence among the rival gods of the nations. That's what to look for in this story. Daniel is the most favored advisor. Daniel is incorruptible. Now, corruptibility is not a function of the earthly master, but the heavenly one. The reason Daniel couldn't be corrupted was he wasn't in it for himself. He was answerable to God. Not just the emperor, but to God, which made Daniel the best possible servant. But we'll see that hitch in a minute. Daniel serves earthly masters best by serving his heavenly master first. There's the key. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May Darius live forever." That's what you say to the king. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce this decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Sounds wonderful. Here's a problem that you often see with these pagan emperors that you find often in the later prophetic books, especially in the book of Daniel. They're subject to flattery. And everybody knows this. You have someone who's high and in charge. You don't say anything bad to the boss. Why? The boss takes offense. You get an emotion. You want to be the boss's favorite. You don't know how ladders work. You kiss up the ladder and you kick down the ladder. That's exactly what's happening here. They're kissing up to the boss and they're saying, "Oh, we know how to get Daniel. We can't find any corruption in Daniel because he serves his earthly master best by serving his heavenly master first. So let's get at his worship of his heavenly master. Let's concoct this law, and the king, who's just eating up all this adoration, will say, 30 days to celebrate me. Doesn't that sound grand? Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So the king says, "Sounds great. 30 days to celebrate me and no one but me." So he makes the law. Now, Daniel learned about this law, and what's Daniel going to do? And all of Daniel's rivals knew exactly what Daniel was going to do. You could set your clock by Daniel. Daniel learned that the decree had been published, and he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Notice the interchange. Daniel serves his earthly master best by serving his heavenly Father first. Then these men went as a group, found Daniel praying and asking God for help. The trap has been set. Daniel is predictable. The trap has been sprung. We're going to get Daniel out of the way. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. "Remember that law we had you pass? Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decrees that you put in writing. They couldn't find corruption in him. They couldn't find negligence in him. So they made a law that they knew he would break. He still prays 3 times a day. And then the king thought, I've been had. I've been had by my own slaves and servants. Then the king heard this. He was greatly distressed. And he determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Because he knew Daniel was his best guy. And he knew Daniel had been set up. But he knew he couldn't undo the law. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said, now remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. In other words, king, we've got you. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, with the rings of it, and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Now, this is the book of Daniel. There's all of these tests. They're called ordeals. They're basically you give someone over to the dangers of nature or the dangers of natural outcomes. In the first chapter was a test of food. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego only ate water and vegetables, and they flourished better than the others, the rich food of the king's court. And so they were proven faithful. Common tests of water ordeals are baptism. It's a ceremonial ordeal. In chapter 3, you have the fiery furnace where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, again, for refusing to bow down to the idol of the empire, are thrown into the fiery furnace, and they're delivered. Now you have tests by wild animal. Demonstrates the basic premise of the advisor of the Magi. Will the outcome by their religion be better or worse? Do they have the spiritual power that can pay off in the common world we all share? Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of day, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. See, he's a faithful servant, even of a pagan lord who doesn't have the foresight to make good laws. May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lion. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. There's the ordeal. He's innocent. The lions wouldn't touch him. Nor have I done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. There's the moral of the story. This is to Israel under exile, struggling to be faithful, even as they are in exile because they were unfaithful. At the king's command, because kings could do this, the men who had falsely accused Daniel, well, was it really a false accusation? The men who had set the trap were brought in and thrown to the lion's den, along with their wives and children. Now again, you notice this pattern. Often in the Old Testament, in the desert wanderings, the wives and the children would suffer the fate. Well, think about Achan, who stole from Jericho. The wives and the children would suffer the fate. This was the worst fate imaginable, to have your generations cut off. Very common in that culture. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. In other words, case closed. God shut the mouths of the lions. Daniel is God's favorite. He's rescued in the ordeal. Israel's God is true. See what happens next. King Darius wrote to all the nations and the peoples of every language in the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Wow. Great story. These are the stories we love. As with all the previous chapters, Daniel shows himself to be pure, loyal, powerful, and victorious over all his rivals. And even so, he doesn't do it with violence. He does it being the best servant of even the pagan monarch. Daniel is not vindictive or petty, self-serving or aggressive. But Daniel in chapters 7 through 12 will be very anxious about the situation of the world, the situation about God's mission among and through the nations of the earth. But the story seems to end on exactly the high point that everyone wants. Don't we want the Persian emperor to say, "Israel's God is the God of the world"? Well, Israel's kings did that too, but the high places persisted, and other religions would come. You see, one of the things that we greatly overestimate, and we hear this in our country as well, we want the President of the United States. Wouldn't it be great if the President of the United States passed a law that everyone had to go to church on Sunday? Wouldn't it be great if the Internal Revenue Service taxed Americans directly to pay for our churches? Wouldn't it be great? Now, many of you hear that and say, "Oh, I'm not so sure that's a good idea." It was done in Europe for centuries. In fact, in many places in Europe, well, they got a lot more freedom of religion, but in many places in Europe, the churches are supported through tax dollars. That's a state church. Here in America, no, the IRS does not give money to living stones. This seems to be the best possible thing. Daniel's religion, how the world works, was superior to his rivals. Daniel is saved from the lion's den. His rivals are killed by the lions. Daniel is the best sort of servant any king could want. Daniel is resigned to whatever his heavenly master finds to be best, whether death by lion or deliverance. Kind of looks like Jesus in Gethsemane. "If it be your will, but your will be done." Daniel is perfectly aligned with the realignment of God's mission in a pagan world. And what you see in the first 6 chapters of Daniel is Nebuchadnezzar and then Darius all proclaiming Israel's God is the great God. But does that fix the world? Now, Daniel's story sometimes feels cruelly convenient because Daniel was saved by from the lion's den. Do you know what Romans, this last summer I was able to visit the Colosseum in Rome. There's a big cross right on the Colosseum floor. Do you know why? because lions ate Christians all the time. And I'm sure the Christians, who didn't even have the New Testament yet, they were reading the book of Daniel, and I'm sure they thought, why would Daniel not be touched by lions? And Christians would be touched by lions. Oh, I wish the good guys always won, don't you? Shouldn't people in alignment with the Creator always win? If you're doing the right thing, if you're going to church, if you're praying, shouldn't it mean that you don't get sick? You don't age? Shouldn't we be exempt from everything? Now, it's helpful to remember that Daniel was written to a people who were suffering incredible loss. They were under the subjection of these empires pretty much permanently. Daniel had suffered loss, and plenty of it. Remember, he was a young man, hauled out of his land, likely castrated, to become a permanent slave to whatever pagan emperor was in charge. Daniel wasn't saved from that. Now, this is a deliverance story and should be celebrated as such. It's a story we love. Daniel is a tremendous example of faithfulness in the face of persecution, of the power of God to deliver, of the witness of God, and of the victory of God. But how much good did Darius's decree really do? Is the human heart really changed in such a direct fashion? If the President of the United States passed an executive order that all Americans must go to church, and the U.S. Army was going to enforce this decree, the churches would be a lot fuller, for sure. But would people's hearts really change? See, there's a fantasy element to this story. If only the powerful, famous, esteemed people of the world would use positional power of empire and state to enforce the worship of the one true God, then what? Here it happened. Did the world change? How then does it work? You see, Jesus and Daniel have a lot in common. Both are working under pagan, corrupt imperial regimes. Daniel is up high in the court. Jesus is completely ignored for a few centuries. Both will be subject to unjust persecutions. Both will be subject to an ordeal. If you are the Son of God, come down from that cross and save yourself. And he doesn't. Here's where the deep change begins. He saves others by not saving himself. Truth be told, Daniel didn't save himself. God saved him. Daniel had no power over those lions. God did. His proclamation on the cross and the empty tomb become far more effective than the edict of Darius. Notice that. Now, it takes time. It's much more subtle. It's much more slow. But we don't find the edict of Darius effective anywhere in the world today. But building after building after building have the cross of Jesus over them. Darius might obtain formal compliance through the power of the sword, just like if the President of the United States, by the order of the enforcement of the U.S. Army, forced people to go to church. Well, you can get people in the building. But is this really what God is looking for? Jesus, however, evokes voluntary submission through love. Nobody forced any of you to go to church here today. You all came of your own volition. And I think that is worth far more than if the government made you come. And this runs through the Jesus story repeatedly. And this is the strangeness of the Jesus story. And this is where Jesus is so confusing to the empires and in many cases also the religion of the world. And As is often the case when I talk to people who are secular or of other major religious traditions, the one thing they keep coming to me is, well, we want more law and we want more enforcement. There are good things about law and there's good things about enforcement. We all want the government to have laws and we all want police and the government to enforce the laws. But there is something else that needs to happen, and that is the change of our hearts to Him. And that is what Jesus does that Daniel cannot do, that Isaiah could not do, that David and Solomon could not do, that all of the governments in the world and all of their power to enforce compliance could not do. Because what we are impressed with is that Jesus loves. It's the power that a mother has. It's the power that a father has. It's that power that actually changes the world. Because on the night that Jesus was betrayed, everyone was expecting the ritual and the routine of the Passover celebration that they had all known for centuries, how God with a powerful hand rescued Israel from Egypt. He took bread and he broke it and he said the strangest thing. They would have loved to have heard, this is the Roman Empire that I'm going to break open. He doesn't say that. He said, this is my body, broken for you. This is not a God who demands, although he does make demands. This is a God who loves and backs his demands by demonstrating he is in it more than we are. My body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.